Educators often talk about the importance of knowing their students, and we've talked about that with you both last semester and in this semester in the context of your face-to-face students in placement and also in the context of your e-tutor students. But what do we mean when we say get to know your students? We mean get to know the whole student and to know them beyond a superficial level. You need to know what your students already know, how they learn best, with whom they learn best, what engages them in their learning, and what factors beyond school influence their attitude and aptitude for learning. Without knowing your students, it makes it more difficult to build an effective learning community in your classroom or in whatever learning setting you are teaching in. It's also really important to know your students to inform your planning. With your first major assessment task, a sequence of 3 lesson plans, we're expecting you to draw on your deep knowledge of the students you will be teaching in your small group. To that end, we're asking you to construct a learner biography of 2 students in that small group. This is often the invisible part of teaching that we don't see. Experienced teachers sometimes, but not always, document how they know their students. Beginning teachers should be documenting the extent to which they know their students and use a range of audit tools. And in this workshop, we're introducing you to the practice of constructing learner biographies. Throughout the course so far, you've been building a learner biography of yourself. You may not necessarily have been aware of that, but that's what I've been getting you to do. We started by looking at the life world, your life world. And what we've asked you to do this week is to use that same approach and, as far as you're able, to construct that concept for the students that you're examining. I've also asked you to construct your own identity tables, as we have here some examples from your textbook. What is it that helps you be in or out or in between, or what doesn't help you to be in? I guess what we're asking you to do is to apply these practices to the children in the Ladner Virtual School. Next week, when you start placement, you'll be constructing learner biographies for the real children in your classroom, in your placement classroom. Teachers also use a range of observation tools or anecdotal note-taking devices and audits. And I've put in the next few slides some examples taken from the textbook. This one is looking at the level of participation by students in class discussions, what sort of questions they raised or the extent to which they asked questions, how often did they initiate ideas. And in this particular example, Anna has given a score for each of the children, which identifies who's contributing well in discussion and who perhaps needs to be supported further to do so. It's data like this that you can draw on to help construct your learner profile. We talk a lot also about the importance of collaborative learning. In this particular audit tool, Anna has identified the extent to which the children participate in the characteristics of effective collaborative learning. Once again, she's scoring them. And over time, by comparing one observation with another or a series of observations, you get to know the patterns of your students' learning. And you can also identify whether they've made progress with their learning. In this example of an audit, Anna has been observing the students' technology literacy and their attitude and aptitude to learning with technology. Once again, identifying who might be the leaders in her class in this area, who might need further support and further opportunity to extend their computing skills. So these sorts of tools are used as diagnostic tools, but they also inform the detailed planning that occurs by teachers where they identify which children need that additional support and which children might need to be extended. In your classroom, you'll find other forms of data that you can use to help construct a learner biography. This particular chart maps the different mechanisms or approaches used to measure reading levels between schools, depending upon which system that they use. And reading levels is another thing that you can use. Look at the data that your teacher has on your students' reading abilities and look at their progress from one period to another. NAPLAN results might be another form of data that you might be able to access about the students in your small group. This is an example of a reading and writing report for a Year 3 student. To help you interpret these, just in case you haven't ever seen them before, the black dot here shows where this particular student is. So in reading, this student is at band 4, whereas for Year 3, the national average is at the top of band 4, a bit higher than where this student is for reading, and the school average is in band 5. So this student, whilst performing within the 60% of Year 3 students' range, this is the range here, where 60%, the middle 60% of children in grade 3 nationally are reading. This student is in that range, but a little bit below national average and a bit below the school average. However, when we compare that to their persuasive writing, they're performing much better at that. The school average is down here, the national average is here, and the range extends from here to here. So the student is performing at the upper end of the average range. So NAPLAN results. However, remember that NAPLAN results are a snapshot. They're taken at one point in time. Comparing results over time gives you a much stronger picture of how a student is performing. And comparing results over a number of different sources of their data gives you a much deeper and richer picture of how the student is performing. Another thing that you can do is to collect work samples from your student. Within the Australian curriculum, for the curriculum areas that they have covered, they include work samples. If you scroll right to the bottom of each level, there will be a link to PDF files that show you annotated work samples. So here we have an example of a student's writing activity, a response to a visual text. And here you have the annotations that describe what characteristics of learning are being demonstrated in the particular work sample. And ACARA will provide you with a work sample at the average level, a student who is below average, and a student who is displaying above average capability for that particular standard. And you can use these as a way to help you make judgments about where your students' capabilities lie. Are they above, below, or at average levels? And whilst that's interesting, it just helps you to know, it's interesting in and of itself, but really who cares? Your job as a teacher is to help that student progress their learning, whether they are average, above average, or below average. So your task is really to use this information to help you plan, right, if that's where they're at, where do I need to take them next? Knowing where they're at in and of itself is just a tool for you to help you with your planning, to help teach to make them progress their learning. And they're just some of the, couple of the links to the work samples. That's the link to the English Year 3 work sample that I gave you from the Australian Curriculum Authority. And the second URL is to link to the descriptions of the progression points from AusVels at the Victorian level. Again, progression points will help you break down even further and identify where along the continuum of learning the students you're teaching might be located. Again, helps you identify a point in time, but helps you identify where the next levels of progression might be that you help them aim to achieve. We've asked you to create learner biographies for the students in the Lather Virtual School as a practice run for creating the learner biographies that will inform your planning of the 3 lesson plans, and that will also inform the report on your learner to your teacher mentor for your second assessment task. We've divided the learner biography into 3 sections. One is about their learning. So summarise and describe the learner, drawing on their work samples, observations and audits that you've conducted, and other data that you've been able to collect. For example, some of the sorts of things that I've outlined in this workshop. But we also need you to go beyond just their learning levels. We would like you to get to know what their learning habits are like. How do they learn? What are their habits in the classroom? Are they easily distracted? Do they remain on task and focused? Do they get up and wander around? Draw upon observations and audits once again. Then we'd like you to focus on the whole learner. This is what happens beyond the classroom. What are their relationships to other students in the classroom and outside of the classroom, in the playground, for example? What are some of the equity considerations? What are some of the dimensions of difference that might emerge from things like their identity tables and their life world concept maps? Again, draw upon the observations and audits. Draw upon your conversations with the students and what you've noticed about them. When you combine these 3 elements of a student, you have a much deeper and richer knowledge of your students than just getting to know them as they walk in the door of your classroom. And this information about this deep knowledge of your student helps you to be able to target the learning to best support their individual needs. In the workshop, we spent time presenting and refining the learner biographies that you had commenced, and we responded to these sorts of questions, looking at what sort of stereotypes and labels might have been used with the students, how else you might describe the students to avoid those stereotypes in much the same way we did in the workshop last week. We looked at the factors from beyond the classroom that have an impact on their learning, and we looked at establishing a baseline level of learning for each student. We also thought that there was a fair bit of data missing on these students, and then started to identify what additional data or evidence would be needed to create a more comprehensive learner biography. And this was to set you up to be successful in your next 2 assessment tasks. As I said at the beginning of this workshop, next week when you're on placement, you'll be creating those learner biographies onto real students. So this was a practice activity to scaffold you into the process.